So, the three items I'll be discussing today: General Code, abolition of the lifetime allowance, and changes to defined contribution benefit statements. And so given the time I have to discuss all three areas today, it'll just be a brief overview of all of them. And so starting with the General Code. The Pension Regulator publishes codes of practice to give practical guidelines for pension schemes, trustees and managers to comply with the requirements in pensions legislation. They cover governance and administration requirements for all types of pension arrangements. For a number of years, the regulator has been working to consolidate the codes of practice into a single code. And it will be known as the General Code to simplify the existing regime. The content of the code is pretty much largely the same, though it does remove some duplicate information with updates to reflect changes to the law and regulatory environment. The code aims to clearly set out the expectation for pension schemes, including some new requirements, which I will cover shortly. Now, the General Code will come into force on the 27th of March 2024, so just under a month away, and will be in a new format, so not the unconnected PDFs that we're currently used to, but instead a web-based modular approach, which will be published on the regulator's website. And the regulator has said that this General Code will then be easier for them to keep up to date going forward. So I've set out on this slide the current 15 codes of practice in place, with the green ones showing the ones that will be combined into the General Code. And the regulator has said that it plans to combine the 5 remaining codes, shown in red, into the General Code in due course. The General Code has been structured into 51 modules across 5 areas, and we'll look at each of these areas in details on the next few slides. So those 5 areas are shown in the colours down the bottom, and we'll start with the governing body. Now, although the General Code is a long document, currently over 170 pages, there's a lot of material that will be familiar to pension scheme trustees and managers, and therefore they're likely to already be complying with a lot of the guidance. For example, if we take the knowledge and understanding item there, the regulator's expectations around trustee knowledge and understanding, it's just being restated and then slightly expands to cover the new requirements within the code. There are then strengthened expectations for professional trustees around accreditation. So within this area, there's a lot to cover, and I'm going to focus on the 3 that I've put in red there, that the new requirements. The first being the remuneration and fee policy. This is a new requirement for schemes with 100 members or more, but it excludes public service schemes and authorised master trusts. So the trustees that must comply prepare a written statement which explains the decision-making process behind remuneration levels for all parties involved with the scheme's activities and why that remuneration is appropriate. The draft code originally required the governing body to make that policy available to scheme members on a website or by some other means, but that has been removed from the final code. And there was a lot of feedback to the regulator on the draft information within the code on this particular policy, and it has revised the requirements so that the scope of each remuneration policy will be more scheme specific than the draft code originally planned. It is also made clear that the policy is a framework for assessing whether governing bodies are receiving value for money and does not require them to disclose specific remuneration figures, which was a concern. So the next one then is the effective system of governance, and there's a theme throughout mine is the introduction of a load of new acronyms. And so this is number 1, ESOG, which is the effective system of governance, including internal controls. An ESOG is essentially a collection of processes and policies that a scheme should have in place in order to operate effectively and efficiently. The ESOG should be proportionate to the size, nature, scale, and complexity of the activities of the scheme. An ESOG must have documented processes and procedures that comply with a number of the modules in the new code, covering items under management of activities, organisational structure, investments and member communications. Once an ESOG is established, each element should be reviewed at least every 3 years or sooner if there is a significant change in the scheme's governance or key risks, to see whether it is functioning as planned. And then the third new requirement is the second acronym, ORA, Own Risk Assessment, and this is a new requirement for schemes, again with more than 100 members, to undertake and document an examination of how well the effective system of governance is working and how any potential risks are being mitigated. The first ORA, and this should be completed within 12 months of the end of the first scheme year after 27th of March 2024, or if later within 15 months of the next actuarial valuation or the next chair statement. But essentially, schemes have a minimum of 2 years to put this in place. It is not necessary for all elements forming an ORA to be assessed at the same time, but the ORA should be completed at least every 3 years. And the ORA must be in writing, signed by the Chair of Trustees, and made available to the regulator on request. The regulator has confirmed that it won't be producing templates for the ESOG and ORA. It will be down to trustees to produce them themselves, and one of the reasons behind this is the complexities around all the scheme variations and the regulator not wanting it to be like a tick box exercise. So the next area within the code following governing body, the next one then is funding investment, and although it's titled this, it currently covers just investment. And a couple of key points just to note on this one is that governing bodies need to identify and document any investments not traded on a regulated market and why they are being used, and also there's expectations around stewardship. The next area then is on scheme administration, and the key items I wanted to mention on this is the regulator's emphasis on trustees' knowledge of administration, understanding the duties of their administrators, administration being a rolling agenda item at meetings, and then the emphasis on reducing and managing cyber risk. The previous focus was on eliminating risk, and the regulator has moved on from that to be monitoring and reducing. And then the last two areas, which I don't have much to say on, these two in particular. So the first is covering communications and disclosure, covering information to members and public information, and then reporting to the regulator, which also includes whistleblowing. So with the new general code coming in, what are the next steps for trustees? And on this slide, I've set out a few actions. First being add general code to business plan for this. There's going to be a lot of policies and procedures and work coming out of this to put in place, and acquiring training as needed. Then the first step will be to undertake a gap analysis, find out pretty much what policies you need to draft and put in place, produce your effective system of governance, and then if required, the ORA. And if you're not a trustee, then I do believe this is a good opportunity for you to review your pension arrangement to ensure it remains fit for purpose. For example, I put in the slightly lighter grey bullet points there some things to consider are the member charges, providing good value to your members. And it is good governance to do this on a regular basis. So the next topic then is the abolition of the lifetime allowance. Now, the lifetime allowance was introduced 18 years ago from 6th of April 2006, known as A-Day. It assesses the overall value of pension savings an individual has when they retire. The lifetime allowance has ranged from 1 million at its lowest all the way up to 1.8 million at its highest, and been many other amounts in between. And it's currently just over £1 million. And then there were protections brought in when the lifetime allowance reduced. If an individual exceeds the lifetime allowance, they would be subject to a tax charge on the excess, and then if the excess was taken as an income, the tax charge was 25% plus their marginal rate, and if taken as a lump sum, it was 55%. So a bit of background on lifetime allowance, and then it all goes out the window because back in the spring budget 2023, the government announced that the lifetime allowance would be abolished. And this would be done in 2 stages. So from 6th of April last year, the lifetime allowance charge was removed. And then next month, 6th of April, the lifetime allowance framework is being completely removed. And this date, 6th of April 2024, is now being known as L Day. The legislation to remove the lifetime allowance from pensions tax law was published back in November as part of the Finance Bill 2023-24, which received royal assent last week on the 22nd of February. Now, to ever complicate matters, with the removal of the lifetime allowance, new allowances have been introduced. And this is where my acronyms come in. So we've got the lump sum allowance, LSA, and the lump sum and death benefit allowance, LSDBA. And in turn, benefit crystallisation events that are triggered when members take their benefits are being removed and replaced instead with relevant benefit crystallisation events, or RBCs. The government is also introducing a third new allowance to limit tax-free transfers overseas, called the Overseas Transfer Allowance, OTA. So looking at these in a bit more detail, the lump sum allowance will be tested when members take benefits often referred to as tax-free cash. So this includes the pension commencement lump sum, PCLS, the uncrystallised funds pension lump sum, also known as UFPOLs, and the standalone lump sum. The LSA is set at £268,275, which is essentially 25% of the current lifetime allowance in place. And so maintaining the total amount of tax-free cash an individual can take and benefit from under the current system from April 2024, and any excess then over that limit will be taxed at marginal rate. The lump sum death benefit allowance applies on death before age 75 and will test those lump sums as under LSA, so those same 3 lump sums, as well as the serious ill health lump sum and the lump sum death benefits except for one. The excess over that will be taxed at marginal rate. The allowance is set at the exact same amount of the current lifetime allowance of just over £1 million, and so that no one is in a worse off tax position. Individuals can take lump sums above this limit, excluding the pension commencement lump sum, just that the limit dictates the tax treatment. And both new allowances may be enhanced if individuals have valid protection in place. Now, for members who have taken benefits before 6th of April 2024 and used up some of the current lifetime allowance framework, there will be transitional arrangements in place to determine their available allowance under the new regime. The standard transitional calculation is where it broadly assumes that 25% of whatever lifetime allowance used up before 6th of April was taken as tax-free cash. And so the available allowance will be reduced by 25%. And this will likely provide the correct tax outcome for the majority of pension savers, because most people, when they retire, take the 25% lump sum. So just looking at a quick example, for someone who's used up 30% of the lifetime allowance before 6th of April, their lump sum allowance would be reduced by 25% of the 30% of the lifetime allowance. Essentially, it works out to be just over £80,000, and that is then deducted from their lump sum allowance, giving them a remainder of around £188,000. Now, for members who didn't take that 25% tax-free lump sum in benefits taken before 6th of April, there is an additional option for those individuals to provide evidence to schemes that they have taken less than that in order to receive a transitional tax-free amount certificate. They really don't name them easily. And if the scheme is satisfied that the evidence is sufficient to show that they have taken less, then they can reflect the amount of their remaining allowance, and they're granted that certificate with the lump sum allowance calculated accordingly. So pension schemes really do have a short amount of time now, a very short window, to update processes and communications to comply with the new law. And we would recommend a review of scheme rules to be undertaken to check for any provisions around eligibility criteria, benefit caps, or perhaps whether age 75 rules are hard-coded. And it is important that schemes ensure the new rules and correct tax treatment is applied from 6th of April, which is just over a month away. And then the final item to cover today is defined contribution benefit statements. So from the 1st of October 2022, going back a bit, the Occupational and Personal Pension Schemes Disclosure of Information Regulations that were released in 2021 introduced new requirement for trustees and managers of defined contribution pension schemes that provide pure money purchase benefits and are used for auto-enrolment. And the amendments made within these regulations related to the information to include in the annual benefit statement to essentially make them simpler. And they did this through providing a template, and on the right-hand side of the slide there, I've included a copy. And the idea behind this was simply to make them easier for members to understand. It's very likely that a lot of members have had lots of employment with lots of money purchase benefits, and so receive a lot of statements, and with them being in the same format, would allude to them being an easier way for them to consume and understand the information shown. The statements should not exceed a double-sided A4 piece of paper if posted, or the equivalent length if sent by email or online. And the statement is split into 5 sections. The first is just a bit of information around the member, so it's shown at the very top, member and pension scheme details. The second shows up how much you've built up in your plan to date. In the third section, it shows how much you could have at retirement. Fourth, how you could have more money. And then fifth, essentially more information. And typically there'd be links then to online where members can find more information, for example, on the charges. Now, last year, further changes were introduced to assumptions within the benefit statements that are used, and this is applicable to the third section, the how much you'll have at retirement. So the Actuarial Standards TM1, which sets out the assumptions to use, stated that for statements issued after 1st of October 2023, they had standardised the future investment growth assumptions and the form of the annuitisation at retirement. And these new standards assumptions all feed into what Chris went through for the pensions dashboard. That's the thinking behind this. They'll use the same assumptions, and so the calculations will marry up for the pension dashboard. So looking at the 2 new assumptions in a bit more detail, the first, the future investment growth. So funds are now assigned a volatility group between the numbers 1 and 4, and previously the assumptions were based on the asset class of the fund. And you will see a variation. Some members will have an increase in the amount that they can expect to receive at retirement, and some will be lower. It will very much depend on how that fund is now classed under the volatility group. But for annuities, typically, they have been quoted with an increase and a spouse's pension attached. And under the new requirements, they should be level income, no spouse, with a 5-year guarantee. And so for statements issued after October 2023, generally that would show a higher amount of income a member could receive in retirement when taken as an annuity. And then, of course, it doesn't stop there. So the calculations performed on or after 6th of April, there will be a further change to the future investment growth assumption. This means an increase by 1% for volatility groups 1 to 3. So the 1%, 3% and 5% respectively become 2%, 4% and 6%, but volatility group 4 remains unchanged at 7%. Now, within the guidelines on this, the phrase calculations performed on or after is used. And so this should be considered by schemes, because it can either be interpreted as the calculation performed is when the calculations are actually done. And so for those schemes that have year ends on 31st of March or 5th of April, then the updated rates of calculation could undertaken after 6th of April, and so funds may be placed in different volatility bands to the previous year, as the calculation will be by reference to the 5 years ending 30th September 2023. However, on the other side, if interpreted as calculations performed is equal to the illustration date of the statement, then the scheme year ends before 6th of April will need to use the lower volatility rates in the middle column there, and those will have reference to the 5 years ending on 30th of September 2022. So a lot of the responses to the consultation did raise this. Personally, my preference would have been for it to be the illustration date of the benefit statement. But the Financial Reporting Council has acknowledged the interpretation difference and decided to keep it as at calculations performed, as that's the wording specifically used within the AS TM1 standards in relation to the volatility groups. Thank you.